On the third night, the orderlies stopped counting the walls. Every flat surface inside the east wing of Blackwater State Asylum had been covered, not with words, with drawings, towers that did not stand anywhere in that valley. A city laid out in the shape of a star. Wheels turning inside larger wheels, sketched first in charcoal, then in candle soot, and in the final hours, when they had taken every burnt thing away from him, in something darker. Father Emery Vane had travelled to Blackwater to perform a single exorcism on a single patient. Instead, he filled 40 rooms with a warning nobody could read. And when 4 men finally held him down and bound his wrists to the frame of a bed, he was not screaming about a demon. He was screaming about the building, about what it had been before it was an asylum, about who had put it in the ground and covered it over and given it a new name and a new purpose and hoped the world would forget. Before we go any further, I want one word from you in the comments. If you have ever walked into an old building that felt older than it was supposed to be, older than the date carved on its cornerstone, type the word older down below. I read every comment on these, and by the end you may understand exactly why that feeling matters. Now, the version of this story you will find in the official record is short, and it is tidy, and it explains almost nothing. According to the county paperwork that survives, a visiting clergyman suffered a nervous collapse at the state hospital in the autumn of 1926, was sedated for his own safety, and was later transferred to a private facility where he died some years afterward without recovering. 3 sentences. A man broke down. He was restrained. He faded away. If that were the whole of it, there would be nothing here to talk about, and you would already be watching something else. But the paperwork is not the whole of it, because the paperwork does not mention the drawings. It does not mention that the staff who cleaned that wing refused to go back in after the 2nd week. It does not mention the letter Father Vane mailed to his own bishop 9 days before the collapse, a letter that was quietly removed from the diocesan archive at some point in the 1950s, and has only ever been seen since, in the form of a single photographed page. And the paperwork most certainly does not explain the thing that the people who study Blackwater keep circling back to, the thing they cannot let go of. Father Vane did not draw 100 different pictures across those 40 rooms. He drew the same handful of pictures over and over, in room after room, as if he were terrified that if he stopped, even once, he would forget what he had understood, as if the repetition itself was the point. So tonight we are going to do something the county never bothered to do. We are going to look at the drawings, all of them. We are going to look at the building he was standing inside when he made them. And we are going to take seriously, at least for the length of this video, a working hypothesis that most respectable people will tell you is nonsense. The hypothesis is simple to state and very hard to unhear once you have heard it. The hypothesis is that Blackwater State Asylum was never designed to be an asylum at all, that it was already standing, already old, already ruined and half buried, when the state found it, and that a man of faith, sent there to cast something out of one troubled patient, instead cast something out of the walls, and could not live with what he saw underneath. To understand any of that, we have to start with the building. Not the story people tell about the building itself, the stone. Blackwater sat at the head of a long valley in the hill country, far enough from any town that the people who worked there mostly lived there too. If you saw it from the ridge road on a clear morning, the first thing you noticed was that it did not look like a hospital. It looked like a cathedral that had been stretched sideways. A central tower rose above the tree line, capped with a steep slate roof and a pair of iron finials that caught the light. From that tower, 2 long wings reached out and then broke into smaller wings, and those into smaller ones still, so that the whole footprint spread across the hillside like the arms of something kneeling. The stone was a pale grey that turned almost silver after rain, and the windows, hundreds upon hundreds of them, were tall and arched, and set with a kind of care that no state ever pays for when it is building a place to warehouse the sick. The official story of the construction is where the trouble starts. The cornerstone, which is still there, still legible, carries the year 1871. The state records say the hospital opened its doors to patients in the spring of 1874, which would mean the entire structure, the tower, the wings, the miles of interior corridor, the vaulted basements, all of it, went up in roughly 3 years. And here is the first thing that does not sit right. because the men who later tried to renovate parts of Blackwater, working with modern tools and modern machines, said openly that they could not have matched that pace. The stonework in the oldest sections is cut and fitted so precisely that in places you cannot slide a knife blade between two blocks, and there is no mortar holding them, only the weight and the fit. That is not how state contractors built in the 1870s. That is not how anyone built. Whoever laid those stones was working to a standard that the record does not account for, on a timeline the record cannot support, and nobody in the county has ever produced a single ledger, a single payment, a single named mason for the earliest and most impossible parts of the work. Then there is the shape. From the ground you cannot see it, but from above, from the ridge, or from the old survey maps, the outline of the original core of Blackwater is not the shape of a hospital. It is an 8-pointed star, a perfect one, the kind of geometric footprint you find in the old fortresses of Europe, the star forts, built to deflect cannon fire, all sharp angles and radiating bastions. Except Blackwater was never a fort, was never attacked, was never anywhere near a war. There was no reason on earth to lay the foundations of a rural mental hospital in the plan of a military star, unless the foundations were already there. Unless someone found a star-shaped ruin in that valley, cleared it, roofed it, and built a hospital on top of the bones of something older, something that had been designed for a purpose nobody thought to write down. I want you to hold that image, the silver stone and the buried star, because it is the exact image Father Emery Vane would sketch, again and again, on the walls of the East Wing, before anyone had ever shown him a map. Vane was not a famous man. He was not a celebrity exorcist, if such a thing even existed then. He was a parish priest from 2 counties over, quiet, well-read, known mainly for a long interest in the old languages, and for a temperament so steady that people trusted him with the things they could not say out loud. He had performed the rite of exorcism only twice before in his life, and both times, by his own account, the trouble had turned out to be ordinary human suffering wearing a frightening mask, and both times he had said so honestly, which is not what people who chase demons for attention tend to do. He did not want to go to Blackwater. The request came through the diocese, forwarded from the hospital chaplain, on behalf of a patient in the East Wing whose case had frightened even the doctors. And the reason it had frightened them was the reason it eventually reached a priest at all. The patient had begun to draw. For weeks before Vane ever set foot in the valley, the patient in room 7 of the East Wing had been covering scraps of paper, then the inside cover of a hymnal, then the plaster beside his bed, with the same 3 shapes. A tower with no door, a wheel with teeth, and an 8-pointed star with a single line running straight down through its centre and out the bottom like a root or a wire driven deep into the ground. The doctors assumed it was the disordered work of a broken mind, and they might have been right, except for one detail that none of them could reason away. The man had never been shown a map of the hospital. He had arrived at night, half-conscious, and had never once left the East Wing. And yet the star he kept drawing, down to the number of its points and the angle of its arms, was the exact star buried in the foundations of the building he was trapped inside. A footprint he had no way of seeing. A shape no living person had described to him. He was drawing the ground beneath his own feet, and he could not tell anyone how he knew it was there. That is the case that landed on Father Emery Vane's desk, and the moment he saw the copied drawings the chaplain had enclosed, before he had travelled a single mile, he wrote in his journal a line that the people who study this case still argue about. He wrote, "I have seen this star before, and not in a book." Before we move on to the next room, stop for a second. What you just heard about what the patient drew before the priest ever arrived is the part that changes everything, but it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the full account. The buried star. The impossible stone. It's all in the document link below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. Vane arrived at Blackwater on a grey afternoon in late October, and the first thing he did, according to the chaplain who met him at the gate, was stop the car halfway up the drive and get out and simply look at the building for a long time without speaking. The chaplain assumed he was praying. Later he decided the priest had been listening. Vane said only one thing before they went inside. He asked how deep the basements went. The chaplain told him 2 levels, maybe 3 in the old core. Nobody was quite sure because some of the lower rooms had been bricked off before the state ever took possession. Vane nodded as if this confirmed something, and they walked in through the great arched doors of the central tower, and the case began. The patient was a man of about 40, named in the records only by his initials, so we will call him the Sleeper, because that is nearly what he was. He was not violent. He was not raving. Most of the day he lay still with his eyes open, and he ate when fed, and he answered questions in a flat, far-away voice, and then, without warning, at odd hours, he would rise and go to the nearest wall and begin to draw. If you took the charcoal from him, he would use his fingernail. If you bound his hands, he would weep, not from pain, but from what looked to the nurses like a terrible frustration, the frustration of a man who has an urgent message and no way to deliver it. And through all of it he kept saying, quietly, over and over, a phrase that had gone into the file exactly as spoken, "It is not finished. They only covered it. It is still down there, and it is still running." Vane spent his first 2 days simply sitting with the man. This is worth noting, because it is not what a showman does. He did not sprinkle water or shout in Latin. He sat, and he watched the sleeper draw, and he wrote down what the man said, and he began, very carefully, to ask the man questions, not about demons, but about the drawings. What is the tower for? Why does the wheel have teeth? What runs down through the centre of the star and into the ground? And the sleeper, who could barely hold a conversation about his own name, answered these questions readily, fluently, the way a tired workman describes a job he has done 1,000 times. "The tower is where it comes in from the sky," he said. "The wheel is how they turned it. And the line through the star," he said, "the line through the star is how they sent it down into the world, so that every house and every lamp and every cold room could be warm before the water came, and they decided we could not be trusted with it. Now, a rational man hears that and files it under delusion, and Vane, to his enormous credit, tried to do exactly that. His journal from those first days is the journal of a skeptic doing his job. He notes the man's symptoms. He considers grief. He considers fever. He considers the plain and ordinary madness that fills a place like Blackwater with sad and harmless people who see patterns that are not there. He writes that he intends to perform the rite as requested, gently, to give comfort, and then to recommend the man be left in peace. He was, in other words, ready to go home and report that there was nothing here but a suffering mind. And then, on the 3rd evening, something happened that Vane could not file under anything at all. He was walking back to his room along the main corridor of the east wing, late, with a lamp, and he passed a tall arched window, and through it, by chance, the moon came out from behind the clouds and lit the courtyard below. And in that light Vane saw, for the first time, the pattern of the paving stones in the old central yard. They had been laid, long ago, in a design. Radiating lines, running out from a central point, crossed by rings, the whole thing half swallowed now by grass and later repairs. It was a wheel with teeth. It was the sleeper's second drawing, enormous, underfoot, hidden in plain sight in the oldest part of the grounds, a pattern the patient in room 7 had reproduced on a wall without ever once being allowed outside to see it. Vane went back to his room and did not sleep, and in the morning the chaplain noticed the priest had stopped asking whether the man was mad. He had started asking who built the courtyard. The rite went ahead 4 days later, in the small hours, in room 7, with the chaplain and 2 orderlies present as witnesses. And what happened during it is the hinge on which this whole story turns, so I want to give it to you as plainly as the surviving accounts allow, without dressing it up, because it needs no dressing. Vane began the exorcism the way the church prescribes, addressing whatever was troubling the man, commanding it to name itself and to depart. And the sleeper, who had lain flat for most of a week, sat up. The orderlies said his face did not twist or contort the way the films have taught us to expect. It went calm, calmer than they had ever seen it. And, in a voice that the chaplain described in his own notes as sounding like more than one person speaking in perfect time, the sleeper said that Vane had come to the wrong room, that there was nothing inside him to cast out, that the thing the priest kept sensing, the thing that pressed on everyone who stayed too long in the east wing, was not a spirit in a man. It was in the walls. It had always been in the walls. And then the man said something that Vane recorded word for word, underlined twice in a hand the diocese later called unsteady. He said, "You cannot exercise a machine, Father. You can only turn it off." And the ones who built this did not want it turned off. They wanted it buried while it was still on. The rite did not end the way rites are supposed to end. The sleeper did not thrash and then fall quiet and then wake up cured and weeping with relief. He simply lay back down, closed his eyes, and did not draw again. Not that night, not the next day, not ever. Whatever had been driving him to cover the walls had gone out of him completely, as if a hand had been lifted off a wire. The doctors, when they saw him days later, called it a spontaneous remission and considered the priest's visit a modest success. The man ate. The man slept. The man was, for the first time in months, ordinary and dull and calm. And Father Emery Vane began to draw. It started small, and it started, according to the chaplain, almost absent-mindedly. Vane was seen in the library of the East Wing with the old plans of the hospital spread out in front of him, tracing the outlines with a finger, muttering. He requested the county survey maps, the oldest ones, the ones from before the state purchase, and he spent a full day comparing them to the plans, and at the end of that day he was found in the corridor drawing on the wall in pencil. When the chaplain asked what he was doing, Vane looked at him with what the man described as complete lucidity, no wildness in it at all, and said, "I am copying it out before I lose it." He would not say what it was. But the drawing on the wall was the tower with no door, and beside it the wheel with teeth, and beside that the 8-pointed star with the line running down through its heart into the earth. The same 3 shapes the sleeper had drawn. Except Vane's were not the scratchings of a broken mind. They were precise. They were annotated in a small, dense hand, in Latin and in Greek, and in a third script the chaplain did not recognize. And they were correct. When later investigators laid Vane's corridor drawings over the actual buried footprint of Blackwater, the proportions matched to within the width of a pencil line. Here is where I have to be honest with you about the limits of what we can know. Everything from this point forward comes to us through 3 sources, and all 3 are incomplete, and none of them are neutral. There is the chaplain's account, written years later, by a man who was plainly frightened and plainly trying to make sense of something he did not understand. There is the hospital file, which is official and clean and says almost nothing. And there is Vane's own record, the journal and the letter to his bishop, most of which was removed and only a fraction of which survives in photographs. So, when I tell you what Father Vane came to believe over the next 9 days, I am reconstructing it from fragments. I am giving you the working hypothesis that these fragments support. I am not telling you it is proven, because it is not, and anyone who tells you a story like this is proven is selling you something. What I am telling you is that the fragments are strange, and they are consistent with each other, and they point in one direction, and that direction is the thing that eventually put a calm and careful man in restraints. So let us follow where they point. Let us look at what Father Vane drew, shape by shape, and what he seems to have believed each shape meant, because he did not draw those 3 symbols once and stop. Over 9 days he drew them 40 times, in 40 rooms, and each time he added more, and the more he added, the clearer, and the worse, the picture became. The first shape was the tower with no door, and it is the one Vane drew most often, always at the top of the wall, always highest, as if it belonged above everything else. In his annotations he called it the receiver, not the steeple, not the belfry, the receiver. And this is where the story stops being about one hospital and starts being about something much larger, so stay with me. If you have ever looked closely at the great buildings of the old world, the ones that went up in the 1800s and earlier, you may have noticed something you were never taught to question. They are covered in features that do nothing, spires that hold no bells, domes of copper and gilded iron sitting on top of courthouses and exhibition halls, and yes, asylums, structures that had no religious reason to reach for the sky. Antennae, if you want to use a modern word, dressed up as ornament. Blackwater's central tower was exactly this. It rose far higher than any hospital function required. It was capped in iron and copper, and running down inside its core, sealed behind the stone at some point before living memory, was a shaft. A vertical shaft, empty now, that dropped from the very top of the tower all the way to the lowest buried basement and, according to the one survey that ever measured it, kept going, into the bedrock, past the point where any foundation needs to reach. Vane's hypothesis, as best we can reconstruct it, was that the tower had once been the intake point of the building, that the old world which built the star beneath Blackwater did not burn coal or split atoms for its power, that it drew energy out of the air itself, out of the sky and the earth and the difference between them, the way a plant draws it out of light, quietly, everywhere, for free. The tower was the mouth. The copper cap was the tongue, and the sealed shaft down its spine was the throat, carrying whatever it gathered down into the machine below. When the sleeper said the tower is where it comes in from the sky, this is what Vane believed he was describing. Not a metaphor, a mechanism, a building that was, in its original form, an engine for pulling power out of nothing and pushing it into a valley full of homes. I know how that sounds. I know that the moment you say free energy out of the air, half the audience reaches for the back button, and I do not blame them, because that phrase has been attached to 100 frauds and 1,000 fantasies. So let me be careful. I am not asking you to believe that Blackwater was a free energy machine. I am telling you that Father Emery Vane, a sober and educated man with no history of wild belief, appears to have concluded that it was, or that it had been, and that he reached this conclusion not by reading forbidden books, but by standing inside the building, measuring it, comparing it to the ground beneath it, and finding that the numbers described a device and not a hospital. The doors were in the wrong places for a hospital. The corridors were too wide and too tall for a hospital, and exactly right for moving something heavy along fixed lines. The basements were reinforced far beyond what the weight above them called for, as if they had once held equipment that pushed back. And the tower, the beautiful, useless tower, sat on top of it all like the crown on a thing that had once been alive. There is a detail here that I find harder to shake than any of the rest of it. In the oldest photographs of Blackwater, taken not long after the state opened the hospital, the copper cap of the central tower is bright, gleaming. And in every photograph taken afterward, the cap is dull, corroded, dark. Copper does that, of course. It weathers, it turns green and then black over decades, but the change at Blackwater did not take decades. Comparing the dated photographs, the cap goes from bright to dead in a span of roughly 4 years. Something aged that metal fast. Vane, in one of the surviving journal fragments, wrote a single line beside a sketch of the tower. He wrote, "They let it run once more, to be sure it still could, and then they killed it." Whether he meant the state, or someone before the state, or something else entirely, he does not say, but he underlined the word once. And then he moved down the wall, below the tower, and he drew the wheel. The wheel with teeth was the second shape, and Vane always placed it in the middle of the wall, between the tower above and the star below, because he believed it was the middle of everything. In his notes he called it the regulator. A wheel is the oldest machine there is. It turns, it stores motion, it hands motion on. But a wheel with teeth is more than that. A toothed wheel meshes with other wheels. It governs. It takes a wild surging thing and makes it turn at a steady chosen rate. When the sleeper said the wheel is how they turned it, and when Vane copied that wheel 40 times onto 40 walls, the idea underneath was that whatever the tower gathered out of the sky was raw and dangerous, and the wheel, the great regulator buried in the star, was what tamed it into something a valley could actually use without being burned to ash. Remember the courtyard. Remember the pattern in the paving stones that Vane saw by moonlight, the radiating lines crossed by rings, half buried under grass and repair. That pattern was the wheel, laid out at full scale on the surface of the ground, directly above the point where the tower's shaft came down. Vane came to believe the visible courtyard was only the top face of something enormous sunk into the earth beneath it. A structure, or a mechanism, or the ruin of one, that the star fort had been built to house and protect, the way a fortress is built around the thing it cannot afford to lose. The bastions of the star did not point outward to deflect cannon. They pointed outward to hold something in. Now, I told you at the start that we would take a hypothesis seriously, and here is where it widens out past Blackwater and touches everything. Because the people who look at buildings like this, and there are more of them than you would think, keep noticing the same features in the same kinds of structures all over the world. Star-shaped foundations under buildings that were never forts. Towers that gather rather than ring. basements that are buried far deeper than any construction needs, and then bricked off and forgotten. Grand halls that appear in the record fully formed, with no plans, no named builders, no ledgers, credited to some brief burst of construction that the surrounding society had neither the tools nor the wealth to accomplish. And over, at the base of these buildings, the same strange fact: the ground floor is not the ground floor. There are windows below it, arched windows, doorways, whole stories of finished stonework, sitting underground, packed solid with earth, as if the building did not sink, as if the earth rose up around it all at once and swallowed the lower floors, and the people who came afterward simply built their front steps up to the new, higher ground and pretended the buried floors had never existed. That is the heart of the hypothesis Vane seems to have walked straight into, and it has a name now, though it did not then. People call it the mud flood. The idea, stated as plainly as I can put it, is that not so very long ago, more recently than we are taught, some event or series of events buried the lower reaches of an older and more advanced civilization under a tide of mud and earth, and that the world we live in was rebuilt on top of the wreckage by survivors who inherited the buildings but not the knowledge, who found the star forts and the towers and the buried wheels, and could not make them work, and did not understand them, and eventually repurposed the ones still standing into the things they did understand. Courthouses, museums, post offices, and asylums, places to put the sick and the strange, and, if you follow this all the way down, the people who remembered too much. The third shape was the star with the line running down through its heart, and it was always the last thing Vane drew on any given wall, always at the bottom, always closest to the floor, as if it belonged in the ground because that is where it went. In his notes he called it the delivery. The line, he wrote, was not a route and not a wire in the way we would build a wire. It was the path the tamed power took after the wheel had regulated it, driven straight down through the centre of the star and out into the earth and the air of the whole valley at once, so that distance did not matter, so that a lamp 3 miles away lit as easily as a lamp in the next room without a single cable strung between them. When the sleeper said the line through the star is how they sent it down into the world, so that every house and every lamp and every cold room could be warm, this is the picture. A building that did not generate power to be sold and metered and rationed. A building that broadcast it, freely, into everything. And then the sleeper had added the part that Vane could not stop turning over, before the water came, and they decided we could not be trusted with it. That sentence contains the whole tragedy, if the hypothesis is right, and I want to sit in it with you for a moment, because it is the difference between a spooky story and something that might genuinely change how you look at the buildings you pass every day. The mud flood, in this telling, was not only a disaster, it was a door that closed. There was a world, the hypothesis says, in which warmth and light were free, drawn from the sky by beautiful towers and shared by every home, and that world ended, whether by catastrophe or by choice or by some terrible mixture of the two. And when it was rebuilt differently. The towers were capped, the wheels were buried, the delivery lines were severed and forgotten, and the new world, our world, was arranged so that warmth and light would never again be free, so that they would flow through wires you do not own, from companies you cannot see, and stop the moment you cannot pay. Vane's 40 walls, in this reading, are not the ravings of a sick man, they are an inventory, a careful, repeated, desperate inventory of a machine for free abundance, drawn by a man who had realized he was standing inside its corpse. I want to slow down here, because it would be very easy for me to keep pushing this in one direction and never let you breathe, and that is exactly the kind of storytelling that should make you suspicious. So let me lay out the ordinary explanations honestly, the way Vane himself tried to at the start, because they exist, and they are not stupid. The star-shaped foundation could be a coincidence of period fashion, or the reuse of an actual older fort that once stood on the site for reasons long forgotten. The impossibly precise stonework could be the work of immigrant masons whose names simply were not recorded, which happened all the time to men the state did not consider worth naming. The buried lower floors, the arched windows underground, could be the perfectly natural result of a century of regrading, of hills cut and valleys filled to level a difficult site. dressed up by imagination into something sinister. The useless towers could be exactly what the guidebooks say: ornament, ambition, the swagger of a young country building big. And the sleeper, and later Vane himself, could be two men whose minds broke in the same building and reached independently for the same available shapes: the star that was in the ground, the wheel that was in the courtyard, because those shapes were physically present in the environment, and a disordered mind fastens onto what it can see. That is a complete, sane, deflating explanation, and I am not going to pretend it away, and you should hold it in one hand the whole time you hold the other story in the other. But here is what that sane explanation has never accounted for, and what keeps this case alive after all these years. It does not explain the letter. 9 days before he was restrained, Father Emery Vane wrote to his bishop. We know this letter existed because it was logged into the diocesan archive by title and date, and that record survives. We know most of it is gone because at some point in the middle of the last century the letter itself was pulled from the file and never returned, and the only reason we have any of its actual words is that, at some earlier point, a single page of it was photographed, and that photograph passed through enough hands to survive. So what follows is one page out of what the chaplain remembered as many. It is a fragment, but it is Vane's own hand, and it is the clearest window we will ever have into what the building had done to him. On that page, Vane is not raving. That is the first thing that unsettles everyone who reads it. The handwriting is steady. The sentences are complete. He writes to his bishop the way a man writes when he is trying very hard to be believed by someone who has every reason to doubt him. He begins by apologizing for the strangeness of what he is about to say. He states that the patient he was sent to help is recovered and in no further danger, and that in the ordinary sense his work here is done. And then he writes, "And I am giving you this as close to the surviving words as the photograph allows, that he can no longer in good conscience call this place a hospital, because he has come to understand that it is a reliquary, a container built to hold a holy thing. Except," he writes, "the thing it was built to hold is not holy in the way the Church means. It is a work of hands. It is an engine of the world before this one, and it is not dead, only stopped, and something about the recent disturbances, the sleeper, the drawing, has begun to wake the memory of it in the very stone." He writes that he has measured the shaft in the tower and traced the lines in the courtyard and read what little is legible in the buried places, and that taken together they describe a device for drawing the blessing of warmth and light out of the firmament and pouring it, without cost, upon the poor as freely as upon the rich. And then comes the line that the people who study this case quote most often, because it is where the priest stops sounding like a scholar and starts sounding like a man who is afraid. He writes, "If I am right, then the flood was not sent to punish sin. The flood was sent to take this away from us, and whoever sent it wears the face of mercy and means us harm, and has been standing in the doorway of every church, including my own, for longer than we have kept records. He asks his bishop to come. He asks him to come quickly. He says he does not think he will be permitted to leave." That is where the page ends. That is all we have, and you can read it two ways, and honest people do. You can read it as the last coherent document of a good man in the early stages of a breakdown that would take him fully 9 days later, his fear of not being permitted to leave a symptom rather than a prophecy. Or you can read it as exactly what it claims to be, a warning, sent by a sane man who had understood something enormous and knew it would not be allowed to stand. What no one can do is read it and feel nothing, because whichever way it went in Vane's mind, the man on that page believed, with his whole steady heart, that he had found the buried machinery of a stolen paradise inside a building full of people the world had already decided not to listen to. And that is a terrible place to have an insight, true or false. An asylum is the one address on earth where the more certain you are, the less anyone will believe you. If you wanted to hide a truth forever, the hypothesis whispers, you would not burn it. You would put it in the mouth of a madman and let everyone laugh. The bishop did not come. Whether the letter reached him in time, whether it reached him at all before it vanished, we do not know. What we know is that in the days after Vane wrote it, the drawing stopped being the quiet work of a scholar copying out a diagram, and became something that frightened even the men who were paid not to be frightened. It began in the East Wing, and it did not stay there. Over those final 9 days, Father Vane moved through Blackwater room by room, wall by wall, and he drew. He drew in the dormitories and the day rooms and the treatment rooms. He drew in the chapel, on the plaster beside the altar, which the chaplain took as a kind of blasphemy, until he understood, too late, that Vane did not see it that way at all, that to Vane the whole building was already a church of a religion older than his own, and he was only labelling the shrine. He drew in the stairwells. He drew in the long corridor that connected the wings, where the drawings ran unbroken for the length of a city block, tower and wheel and star repeating like a heartbeat you could walk beside. And as he went, the drawings changed, not in their subject, in their urgency. The early drawings, the ones in the library corridor, were careful and annotated and almost tender, the work of a man who wanted to understand. The later ones were faster, larger, cruder, the annotations giving way to single repeated words, the same words the sleeper had said: "It is not finished, they only covered it, it is still running," scored into the plaster hard enough in places to reach the lath beneath. Where he ran out of pencil he used charcoal from the stoves. Where the orderlies took the charcoal he used candle soot smeared with a fingertip. And in the last two rooms, the rooms nearest the sealed stair that went down into the buried levels, when they had taken everything from him that could make a mark, the drawings appear, in the one account that describes them, to have been made with his own blood, from fingertips he had worn raw against the stone. The chaplain, who saw those last two rooms before they were sealed, never described them in detail to anyone. He wrote only that they were correct, and that their correctness was the worst thing about them, because a raving man draws chaos, and Vane, at the very end, past exhaustion, past pain, in the dark, using his own body for ink, was still drawing the machine exactly, to scale. Why does that matter so much? Because accuracy under those conditions is not what madness produces. Madness sprawls, madness contradicts itself, madness draws 100 different terrors. Vane drew one thing, precisely, 40 times, getting more accurate as he grew more desperate, which is the behaviour not of a mind coming apart, but of a mind that has locked onto something real and is trying to get it recorded before the recorder is taken away. Whether the something real was out there in the stone or only in his own collapsing head, the pattern of his behaviour points uncomfortably toward the former. And there is one more detail from those 9 days that I have saved, because it is the one that made me stop treating this as a simple ghost story and start treating it as a genuine puzzle. The doctors, alarmed by the drawing, and by the letter they had intercepted, and by the priest's refusal to leave, brought in men to paint over the earliest of the drawings, to erase them and calm the wing. They whitewashed the library corridor. And within a day the drawings came back, not because Vane returned to them, though at first that was assumed. They came back through the paint. The tower and the wheel and the star bled up through the fresh whitewash as faint grey shapes in exactly their original positions, as if the wall itself had decided to keep them. The rational explanation, and there is one, is that the charcoal and soot were greasy and soaked into porous old plaster and simply wicked back through a thin coat of cheap whitewash, which is a real thing that really happens. The chaplain did not know that. The orderlies did not know that. What they knew was that they had erased the priest's madness, and the building had drawn it again by itself overnight, and after that no amount of reason could keep them in that wing after dark, and honestly, if you had been there, I am not sure it could have kept you either. I want to pull back now, away from Blackwater, and show you the wider country this story sits inside, because the priest did not go mad in a vacuum, if he went mad at all, and the pattern he stumbled into is bigger than one hospital in one valley. And I want to do it carefully, because this is the part where a story like this can tip over into claiming far too much, and I would rather tell you something small and true than something enormous and hollow. Ask yourself a simple question about the century before the one Vane lived in. Who built the world we inherited? Not in the vague sense of kings and generals, but literally, physically. Who cut and hauled and set the stone of the great train stations that dwarf the trains, the exhibition halls that were raised for a single season and then torn down, the courthouses in small towns that could seat the population of a city, the water and sewer systems beneath old cities that later engineers admitted they could not fully map or explain? The official answer is that a young, thin, largely rural society, with hand tools and horse teams, and a fraction of today's population, produced in a few decades a built environment of a scale and quality that we, with all our machines, struggle to match and cannot afford to maintain. Maybe that is exactly what happened. Human beings are capable of astonishing things, but it is at least a fair question to ask, and the people who ask it keep arriving at an idea that goes by an old and disputed name. They call the lost world Tartaria. The name comes from old maps. For centuries, European mapmakers labelled a vast stretch of the northern world with a single word, Tartary or Tartaria, an empire spanning an enormous portion of the landmass, and then, within the span of a few generations, that name simply drained out of the maps and the history books, replaced by a patchwork of smaller states, as if a whole civilization had been quietly written out of the record. The mainstream explanation is that Tartaria was never a unified empire at all, just a loose European term for lands they did not understand, and that its disappearance from maps reflects better knowledge, not a vanished nation. That is a reasonable position. It may well be correct. But sit it next to the buildings for a moment. Sit it next to the star forts, on every continent built to the same geometry, the towers that gather, the buried floors, the construction booms that outran the societies that supposedly performed them, and the picture that some people cannot stop seeing is this: a single, advanced world, spread across the globe with a shared architecture and a shared source of free and abundant power. And then a reset, an event, or a war, or a deliberate act, that ended it, buried much of it under mud and earth, scattered and impoverished the survivors, and was followed by a long, patient effort to explain the wreckage away, to credit the impossible buildings to the poor societies that only inherited them, to cap the towers and bury the wheels and cut the delivery lines, and to teach every child afterward that the world had always been this way, that warmth and light had always cost money, that there had never been anything else. Father Vane, if the hypothesis is right, walked into one small node of that buried network, an 8-pointed star in a forgotten valley, and understood all at once what he was standing on. And the reason his story matters more than the story of 100 other haunted buildings is the timing of it. He did not have the word Tartaria. He did not have the mud flood, or the internet, or a single one of the frameworks that let people today assemble these pieces into a picture. He had a building, a survey map, a patient's drawings, and his own 2 eyes, and from those alone, decades before anyone was talking about any of this, he assembled the same picture independently, and it cost him everything. Which means one of 2 things. Either the picture is a trap that any careful person will fall into if they stare at these buildings long enough, a pattern the human mind manufactures whether or not it is really there. Or the picture is simply true, and true things can be found more than once, by more than one person, working alone, because that is what truth does. It keeps turning up. It bleeds back through the whitewash. We come now to the night they restrained him, and I have to warn you that this is the part of the account where the record is thinnest and the fear is thickest, and where I most want you to keep hold of both hands, the sane explanation and the strange one, because the truth is almost certainly folded somewhere between them. On the 9th day, Father Vane did not eat and did not rest. He worked through the daylight hours and into the dark, moving toward the sealed stairwell at the end of the east wing, the one that led down into the buried levels that had been bricked off before the state ever arrived. The chaplain's account says the priest had become convinced that everything he had drawn on the walls above was only a map, and that the thing the map pointed to, the wheel itself, the regulator, the buried heart of the machine, was still down there in the dark under the courtyard, intact, waiting, and that if he could reach it he could show them, he could prove it was real, he could turn it back on and end the lie in a single night. He had found tools somewhere. He had begun to work at the old brickwork sealing the stair, and when the orderlies tried to stop him, he did not fight them the way a violent man fights. He pleaded with them. He told them they were standing on top of the answer to every cold winter and every unpaid bill any of them had ever known. He asked them, the chaplain remembered, whether their own children were warm tonight, and whether they had ever wondered why that warmth had a price, and who had set the price, and when. And then, when they took hold of him to pull him away from the wall, he went, in the chaplain's words, from a man arguing to a man grieving, and he began to scream, not curses, not the babble of a breakdown. He screamed the inventory. Tower, wheel, star, the receiver, the regulator, the delivery. It is not finished. They only covered it. It is still running. Over and over, as they carried him back down the corridor past 40 rooms of his own drawings, he screamed the machine at them as if the words were the last copy, and he had to get them into someone, anyone, before they put him somewhere the words could not follow. They restrained him in a room in the far wing, away from the drawings, and a doctor sedated him, and in the morning he was calm, and he was never again permitted near the east wing, and within a few weeks he was transferred to the private facility where the record says he lived quietly for some years and then died. That is the official end, a collapse, a restraint, a decline. And it may be the whole truth. Men do break. Good men, careful men, break in terrible places. And Blackwater was a terrible place, and a story does not have to be supernatural to be a tragedy. But there is the matter of the last wall. Before they reached him that final night, before the tools and the brickwork and the screaming, Vane had drawn one more thing, in the small room at the very end of the corridor, closest to the sealed stair, and it was not the tower, or the wheel, or the star. According to the single account that describes it, the chaplain's, written years later, in a hand that shakes on the page, the last drawing was a figure, a standing figure, in the doorway of the machine, with its hand raised, not in menace. In the posture, the chaplain wrote, of someone closing a door, and beneath it, in the last legible words Father Emery Vane ever set down on a wall of Blackwater, was a single line. The chaplain copied it out, and then, he says, he sealed the room himself, and he never went back. The line read, "He is still here, and he is still smiling, and he does not want you warm." The east wing did not reopen. Officially it was closed for repairs, and then for structural concerns, and then it was simply never mentioned again in the annual reports, dropped from the accounting the way an embarrassing relative is dropped from a family story. The men who whitewashed the corridors would not go back a second time. The nurses requested transfers, and the drawings, we are told, were eventually dealt with not by cleaning but by burial. Rather than scrub 40 rooms of plaster that would not stay clean, the hospital sealed the wing behind a new wall, plastered fresh and painted white, and left the tower, the wheel, the star, and the standing figure in the dark on the other side of it, where for all anyone can prove they remain to this day. The sleeper, the patient who started all of it, presents the strangest afterword of all, and it is a quiet one. He recovered fully. He was, in time, discharged, judged sane, sent back into the world, and he never drew the shapes again, and when asked about his months at Blackwater he claimed, gently and consistently, to remember almost none of it. He lived, by the fragments we can find, an ordinary and unremarkable life, which is exactly what you would expect if his episode had been an ordinary illness that ran its course. And it is also exactly what you would expect if, as the strange reading suggests, something had used him briefly as a mouth, and then, once a priest had arrived and taken up the message and carried it into himself, had let the first man go, finished with him, the way you set down a tool you no longer need because you have found a better one. 2 readings. The same quiet man living the same quiet life. You will not be able to tell them apart, and that inability, that permanent inability to tell them apart, is the exact texture of every true piece of this story. Then there is the letter. We know it was logged. We know it was pulled. We know that the pulling happened decades after Vane's death, at a time when there was no living scandal to protect, no career to save, no obvious reason for a diocese to reach into its own archive and remove one dead priest's correspondence about a hospital that had itself long since closed. And yet someone did. Someone decided that a letter written by a broken clergyman about an imaginary machine was worth finding and removing and not returning, and left in its place only a catalogue entry and, by accident or by the mercy of one careless clerk with a camera, a single surviving page. If the letter was the ravings of a sick man, it was harmless, and no one would trouble to hide it. Things get hidden when they are dangerous. That is not proof of anything. It is only a shape. But by now you have learned, watching Blackwater, that shapes are what we get. The star in the ground, the wheel in the courtyard, the figure in the doorway with its hand raised. The gap in the archive exactly the size of one letter. We are never handed the machine itself. We are only ever handed the outline of the place where the machine used to be. Blackwater closed as a hospital long ago, the way nearly all of those enormous places closed, emptied out over a hard decade until the last few patients were moved and the doors were chained. And like most of them, it did not simply vanish. It sat. It stands in some form still, on its hill at the head of its valley, the tower dark against the sky, the wings sagging, the windows going one by one to stone throwers and weather, and every few years someone comes to save it, and every few years the money runs out and it goes back to waiting. Which means that people, ordinary people, curious people, have gone inside. And the reports they bring back are the last thread of this that I can offer you. And they are, as everything here has been, both easy to dismiss and hard to forget. The people who go in looking for the priest's drawings almost never find the east wing, because the sealed wall did its work and the corridor beyond it is not on any map the trespassers carry, and the building is a labyrinth by design, the design of a star. But some claim to have found the fresh wall itself, the anomalous stretch of newer plaster in an older corridor, closing off a passage that the floor plan says should continue. And a smaller number claim to have found their way past it, into a stretch of rooms where the paint on the walls is failing, and where, as the paint fails, faint grey shapes are surfacing underneath it. A tower, a wheel, a star, rising back through the whitewash, patient as ever, exactly where a frightened man was told they had been buried, doing the one thing whitewash was supposed to stop them from doing. I cannot verify a single one of those accounts. Neither can you. The greasy plaster explanation is still sitting right there, as available as it ever was, and it may be all there is to it. But I notice that no one who claims to have stood in that corridor tells the story lightly, and I notice that they all describe the same three shapes, and I notice that not one of them, not one, describes finding 100 different things down there. They describe finding the inventory, still correct, still to scale. As for the shaft in the tower, that at least has been measured in modern times by people with instruments rather than candles, and here the record is genuinely strange in a way that does not depend on anyone's nerves. The vertical shaft running down the spine of the central tower is real, it is sealed, and when it was sounded, it went down farther than the building's own foundations, into the bedrock, terminating, or seeming to terminate, at a depth and in a manner that the survey report describes with visible discomfort as inconsistent with known construction. That is an engineer's phrase, not a ghost hunter's. Inconsistent with known construction. Someone built a hole down the middle of that tower that goes deeper than the building needs, that lines up with the centre of the star in the courtyard, that points straight at whatever is or is not buried beneath the wheel. And no one has ever produced a reason for it that fits inside the ordinary history of a state mental hospital. The hole is simply there, under the dark copper cap, pointing down, the way the priest said it did, at a thing the priest said was still running. And it has been pointing down, patiently, since long before the state ever carved a date on the cornerstone out front, waiting for someone to ask the one question the tour never answers. Here is the thought I cannot leave you without, and it is the thought that I suspect kept Father Vane awake long before it drove him to the walls. He was not the only one. If you go looking, once you know the shape of what to look for, you begin to find the others. Not at Blackwater, but everywhere. A caretaker at a shuttered exhibition hall who spent his last working years insisting the copper dome upstairs used to hum and was told to take his pension and be quiet. An old engineer who worked on the reconstruction of a downtown flooded a century before, who swore to anyone who would listen that beneath the modern street level there was a second city, arched and finished and full, and who could never get a single official to come down the ladder and look. A woman who cleaned a county courthouse for 30 years and would not, at the end of her life, go into the basement, and would only say that the basement had windows, and that a basement with windows is a lie somebody agreed to tell. None of these people knew each other. None of them had a word for what they were describing. They were dismissed one at a time, in different towns, in different decades, and each of them died with their small, strange certainty intact and unheard. Vane's gift and Vane's curse was that he saw the whole pattern at once, in one building, and could not put it down, and paid the full price for lifting it. And that brings it, finally, to you. Because the reason I asked you at the beginning to think about a building that felt older than its cornerstone, the reason I asked you to type that one word is that almost every town has one. You have walked past it. The old bank that is too grand for the money that was ever in it. The train station that could hold 10 times the crowd the line ever carried. The library, the armory, the old hospital on the edge of town with the tower that serves no purpose anyone can name. You were taught, gently and completely, that these are just the ambitions of a confident age, and maybe that is all they are. But now you know what to look at. Look at the base of the building, and ask whether the ground floor might once have been a floor above the ground, whether there are windows sitting at your ankles that were meant for a story now buried. Look at the top, and ask what the tower is for, why it reaches so far past any need, what used to sit under that dark and useless cap. Look at the plan, if you can find it from above, and ask why the footprint is a star. You do not have to believe any of it. Vane started as a skeptic too. All you have to do is look, honestly, at the thing itself, the way he did, and let the building answer for once, instead of the guidebook. Let me be as fair to the ordinary world as I have tried to be all along, because you deserve that, and because a story that only ever pushes you one way is a story that does not trust you. It is entirely possible that Father Emery Vane was simply a good and sensitive man who walked into a place designed, however unintentionally, to break sensitive people, and broke. Asylums did that. The isolation, the sleeplessness, the constant low pressure of other people's suffering, the sheer oppressive scale of those buildings, all of it worked on the mind, and a scholar prone to seeing patterns dropped into a valley full of shapes, latched onto the shapes he could see, and built a cathedral of meaning on top of a foundation of exhaustion and fear. The buried floors are regrading. The star is coincidence, or an older fort honestly reused. The stonework is the unrecorded labour of unnamed men. The humming domes and windowed basements are the misremembered testimony of tired, aging people reaching for significance at the end of hard lives. The shaft in the tower is a ventilation flue, or a water column, or some abandoned mechanical scheme long since stripped for parts. And the letter was pulled from the archive by a clerk who found it upsetting, or embarrassing, or simply in the way. Every single piece has an ordinary explanation, and if you line the ordinary explanations up in a row, they make a wall as smooth and white as the one they built over the east wing. But walls like that have a habit, at Blackwater, of not staying clean, because the trouble with the ordinary explanations is not that any one of them is weak. It is that you need all of them at once, every time, in every town, for every witness, across every decade, and they must never once fail to converge on the comfortable answer, and the shapes underneath must be pure coincidence every single time they surface. That is a great deal of ordinary to ask for. And set against it is one uncomfortable fact that the comfortable reading never quite digests. A patient who could not have seen the foundation drew the foundation. A priest who came to doubt him measured the building and confirmed him. A letter that said too much was made to disappear. And the shapes keep coming back through the paint. You are allowed to believe that all of that is nothing. You are allowed to believe it is everything. What you are not allowed to do, once you have really looked, is believe it is simple. Blackwater took simplicity away from everyone who stayed long enough to see it, and it has now, I am afraid, taken a little of it from you. There is one piece I have deliberately held back until now, because it is the piece that stays with people longest, and I did not want to hand it to you before you had earned the weight of it. It is the last drawing. The standing figure in the doorway of the machine, with its hand raised in the posture of someone closing a door, and beneath it the words, "He is still here, and he is still smiling, and he does not want you warm." Everyone who studies this case wants to know who the figure was. And the honest answer is that Vane never said, not on the wall, not in the surviving page of the letter, not in the years afterward, because in the years afterward he said almost nothing at all. The man who had filled 40 rooms rather than let a single detail escape him spent the rest of his life, by every account we have, in near silence. He did not recant, he did not rave. He did not try again to convince anyone. He simply stopped, as though the message had finally been delivered to the only address that could receive it, his own memory, and sealed there, and there was nothing left to do but carry it quietly to the end. Some read that silence as the flatness of a broken mind, the same remission the sleeper showed, the fire simply burned out. Others read it as the silence of a man who had been made to understand, in that last room, exactly who he was dealing with, and had decided that the safest thing he could do for everyone he loved was to never speak its name again. Because if the machine was real, then someone turned it off. Someone capped the tower and buried the wheel and cut the delivery line and built the lie that warmth must be bought. The mud may have come by nature or by war, but the burial, the whitewash, the careful century of forgetting, that took hands and patience and a reason. And the figure in the doorway, hand raised, closing the door, smiling, not wanting you warm, is Vane's answer to the only question that finally mattered to him, not what was the machine, but who took it from us, and why, and where are they now? His answer, drawn in the dark in his own blood at the end of everything, was that whoever it was did not leave, that they were not a memory or a myth or a dead king in a drained empire, that they were present, ongoing, comfortable, standing in the doorway of the thing they had stolen with the ease of an owner, and that they wore, he had written earlier to his bishop, the face of mercy while meaning us harm. He is still here, not was, is. The most frightening tense in the language, and the priest chose it on purpose, with the last mark he ever made. I cannot tell you he was right. I have tried all night to be honest about that, and I am not going to spoil it now with a certainty I do not have. But I can tell you that a careful man looked at an ordinary building until it stopped being ordinary, and that what he found there frightened him past speech, and that the shapes he left behind are still, by more than one account, rising slowly back through the paint in a sealed corridor on a hill, waiting for the next person careful enough, or unlucky enough, to look. So think, one more time, about the price of being warm. Think about the bill that comes whether the winter is mild or cruel, the meter that turns whether you can afford it or not, the quiet arrangement, older than anyone alive, that decided light and heat would flow to you through wires you do not own from a source you will never see, and would stop the instant you stopped paying. You were born into that arrangement. So was your mother, and hers. It feels as natural and as permanent as the sky. And that, if you follow Blackwater all the way to the bottom of its buried stair, is precisely the point. The most complete theft is not the one you notice and resent. It is the one so old and so total that you cannot imagine the thing that was taken, cannot picture a valley of homes lit for free by a tower that drank the sky, because no one ever told you such a thing was possible, because the people who might have told you were painted over, buried behind fresh white walls, or handed a diagnosis and left to draw the truth on the plaster, where no one respectable would ever have to read it. Maybe none of it is real. Maybe the priest broke, and the sleeper was sick, and the star is a coincidence, and the shaft is a flu, and the warmth was always going to have a price because that is simply how the world is built. I have given you every off-ramp I could find, and they are real off-ramps, and you are free to take any of them and drive home and sleep well. But I think, now that you have seen it, you are going to do what Vane did. I think the next time you pass the 2 Grand Bank, or the 2 Large Station, or the old place on the edge of your own town with the tower that reaches up for no reason anyone can name, you are going to slow down. You are going to look at the base of it for windows that sit too low. You are going to look at the crown of it and wonder what used to be under the cap. You are not going to be able to help it. That is what this story does. It does not give you an answer. It gives you an eye, and the eye does not close again. That was the priest's whole ruin, in the end. Not a demon, not a spell. An eye that would not close, in a building full of things it was not supposed to see, in a country that had agreed, long ago and altogether, not to look. He looked anyway. He drew what he saw 40 times so it could not be erased, and they erased it anyway, and it came back through the paint anyway, and it is still coming back, slowly, on that hill, tonight, while we talk. There is a question that Blackwater forces on you eventually, and it is a practical one, not a mystical one, so I want to end the thinking part of this on solid ground before we say good night. The question is this: how would you actually erase a technology from the memory of the world? Not a document, not a name, a whole way of living, a whole understanding, gone so completely that people cannot even imagine it was ever possible. And the unsettling thing is that it is not hard. It takes 3 generations, and it takes patience, and it takes almost no force at all. You do not have to burn anything. You simply stop teaching the children the thing, and you let the ones who remember it grow old, and you make sure that when the old ones try to describe it, there is no word left for the thing they are describing, so that their own grandchildren hear only the confused talk of someone whose time has passed. The first generation lives through the loss and grieves it. The second generation hears about it second-hand and half believes. The third generation has never heard of it at all. And if you showed them the evidence, the buried floor, the capped tower, the star in the ground, they would explain it to you, patiently, using the only history they were ever given. That is how you bury a machine without a single shovel. You do not attack the memory, you wait for it to become unspeakable, and then you wait a little longer, and the silence does the rest. Father Vane, drawing the same 3 shapes 40 times in 40 rooms, was fighting the only enemy that ever actually wins, not a demon, time and forgetting, and the patient arithmetic of 3 generations. He could not stop it. No one person can. But he could do the one thing that slows it down, which is to make a copy, and then another, and refuse to let the record be clean. Every drawing was a hand reaching across the years toward whoever would eventually stand in that corridor and understand. That is what the shapes bleeding back through the whitewash really are, if they are anything at all. They are a message that outlived the messenger, still arriving, still refusing the silence. And every time you slow down in front of an old building now and let yourself wonder, you are the address it was sent to. You are the 4th generation that was supposed to have forgotten, remembering anyway. At the start of all this, I asked you to type one word if you had ever stood in a building that felt older than it was allowed to be. Scroll down and look at how many people answered. Look at how many strangers, in how many towns, carried that same small, unspoken feeling around for years and never had a name for it and never said it out loud until tonight. That is the thing they could not paint over. Not the drawings on the walls, which they buried, not the letter which they pulled, the feeling, the quiet recognition that passes through an ordinary person when they stand at the foot of one of these impossible buildings and some older part of them, some part that remembers what the guidebook forgot, goes still and says, quietly, "This is not what they told me it was." They could silence a priest. They could seal a wing. They could drain a name off every map in the world. But they could not reach into every one of us and cut out the part that knows. And as long as that part is still in there, still turning, still humming under the cap like a tower that was never fully switched off, the machine that mattered most was never really buried at all. It was only waiting for enough of us to look up at the same time. Father Emery Vane looked up alone, in the worst possible place to be believed, and it cost him everything he had. You get to look up in better company. You get to look up knowing you are not the only one, that the comments are full of people who felt it too, that a valley of us is slowing down in front of the old buildings now and refusing, finally, to look away. He would have wanted that. I think, at the very end, in that last sealed room, drawing a door being closed and warning us the one who closed it is still smiling, that is the one thing he was reaching for, not to be proven right, just to not be the last person who ever looked. So do not be the last. That is the whole ask. Keep looking at the towers and the buried floors and the stars in the ground beneath the towns you thought you knew, and keep saying the quiet thing out loud, because out loud is the one place they could never follow it. If you want to keep looking with me, there is another building, in another valley, with its own buried floor and its own vanished builder and its own person who saw too much and was made to seem mad, and I am going to walk you through that one next. Subscribe so the door to that one does not close before you get to see inside. The priest drew his warning 40 times so it would outlast the people who wanted it gone. The least we can do, the very least, is keep passing it on. He is still here, so are we, and we are finally starting to look up.